creating a really robust dashboard system with charts that you can filter through different day periods, have different ranges, have nice animations. All of this is incredibly difficult to do. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to set up these charts from the most simple version all the way to the incredibly complex versions that has filtering across days, weeks, months, all time. We even have a custom filter for our own date picker, for example. All of this I'm going to show you how to do in React and Next.js. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And to do this charting dashboard, I'm actually going to be implementing it into a project I already have a tutorial on YouTube for, which is an e-commerce Next.js project. That's where this starting code comes from. If you don't want to watch that entire video, I'll have a link in the description of the actual starting code you can download to start right here. But the main reason I'm building it onto this project is so we already have data and an admin dashboard to work with. Now, if you do want to learn how to build this project from scratch, I'll link it in the description and in the cards for you to check out. I highly recommend it. It's my longest video and super in-depth on everything you need to build an e-commerce platform. But this is what the starting code on our dashboard is going to look like. You'll notice everything is pretty much identical to what we have over here. The only difference is this new version that we're going to be building adds in all of this charting information, while obviously this current existing version has no information at all about charting. And that's the only thing I'm going to focus on because while it looks relatively simple, actually making sure all of this works together and integrates all this different filtering is a lot more complex than you would think. Now, in order to get this set up, I'm going to be downloading two separate libraries. The very first library is Recharts, which is just a really great charting library specifically for React. It works really well in React and Next.js and allows you to create really complex or really simple charts using relatively minimal amounts of code. And we're also going to be installing the date.fns library, which just allows us to really easily modify dates. So for example, we can get all this date stuff that we're doing really simply with that. So we can come in here, open up a brand new terminal. I'll make this a little bit bigger so we can actually see what's going on. And we just type in npm I, we want recharts. Make sure it's recharts with an S at the end and date.fns. There we go. That's going to install both of those different libraries for us. Now, the other thing that we're going to need is the calendar component built into shadcn. As you can see, there's a calendar component right here, and this is the component we're going to be used for selecting all of our dates, our range selections, and so on. So in order to set that up, we can just copy this code right here, paste that into our terminal, and that's actually going to install this calendar in our project. And that's just because this project is using shadcn. So that's why we're able to install this super easily. And if we actually look inside of our source folder, we go down into the components UI, you'll notice we have this brand new calendar component being added from shadcn. Now, in order to get started with this project, there's a lot of different things we can do, but the main thing I want to focus on is just working on building out a simple graph just so we can get the idea of how these graphs are formed. So I'm going to close out of this working version and get open to the current version of what our code looks like. And we know that this is all related to our admin section. So I'm going to open up our admin folder. Inside of our components, I'm going to create a folder that's going to be called charts. And this is where I'm going to put each one of my charts. So the very first chart that I want to render out is going to be a chart for the orders by day. We're going to say orders by day chart.tsx. Export function orders by chart or by day chart. There we go. Now this we can render out whatever we want. For now, I'm just going to put some text that says chart, just like that. Super simple. And we're going to import that into our actual project where we're on the admin page. So I go here. This is the main admin page. If I scroll down a little ways, you can see here's where all of our information is going. This is our very first grid that we have. So I'm going to wrap this in a fragment, bring down this line below all this div stuff. There we go. So now we can render out that chart that we just created. So that is orders by day chart. And if we just give that a quick save, you can just see it prints out the text chart. If I zoom that in, you can see that text chart all the way down there. Relatively straightforward. Obviously, we want this to be an actual chart though. So inside of here, to create an actual chart, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. As you can see over here, there's a bunch of different types of charts. We want to focus on a line chart. And if we actually look at the code for this, you can see it's actually relatively straightforward. We wrap everything inside this line chart component, and then we can add the different things we want. For example, an X and Y axis, if we want to have a Cartesian grid show up, if we want to have a tooltip, a legend, each different line that we want to render on our graph, all of these things are just kind of built in. They're relatively simple. You just add what you want, remove what you don't want. So we know that we want a line chart, and we're going to make sure we import that from the right library. So we're going to say line chart, just like that, close that off. And again, we want to import that from the right library. Looks like I need to manually import that. So we'll import line chart from, and that's going to come from recharts, just like that. Now, the next thing we need to do is give this an actual size. We'll just say width is going to be equal to 500. Height is going to be equal to 500. We're going to come in here and fine tune this, but for now, that's just so we have something to look at. The next thing we need to do is pass in what we want our line to look like. So we can say that we're going to have a line that we're passing into this. And we also need to pass in the data that we're going to be using right here. Now, obviously we're going to get that in from our props, but for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a constant variable called data, just so we can work with some placeholder data. And it's just going to be an array of different objects. We're going to have our value, which is just going to be like 12. And then we're going to have something like our date. And it's just going to say new date. There we go. And instead, I can actually just format this as a string. So I'm just going to do something that's like 2024, 12, 12. Or there we go. That's just a random date. Doesn't matter. We can come in here with another value. This one's going to be 25, and this is going to be for the day before. And let's come in here with a value of 5, and that's going to be for the day before as well. So we just have 3 different data points that we're using. And you notice each data point has a value and it has a date. So in order to plot out this line chart, essentially we need to tell our line what the key in our data is. So that is going to be our data key, just like that. Make sure I import line from that correct file. There we go. So we need to say what the data key is going to be. And this is just value. That's essentially the name of the key here. That is the data portion you want to actually chart out. Just doing this is enough to actually give us a chart showing up on our page. If we come over here, give this a quick refresh, you notice we actually get an error. And that's because recharts requires you to be within a client component for it to work. So all we need to do is just come into the top here and add use client to the top of our file, and that should remove this error for us. And as you can see, we now have this line chart showing up. It's kind of ugly and my camera is covering part of it, so I'll just move this out of the way. But as you can see, we have this line chart showing up. Obviously, it's not showing up within any type of grid or system or anything like that. So let's add all of that information in. So we look back over here, we can see we have this Cartesian grid, x-axis, y-axis, tooltips, legends, all these different things. And the order you put them in is really important. For example, if I put my line first and then I put my grid afterwards, the grid will actually show up over top of my line. So what I want to do is put my Cartesian grid over here. So we can say there's my grid right here. And that's going to give me a grid. So now if I come back over here, you can see I get a grid showing up for what my chart should look like. I can also do some other things. We can also reduce this height. Let's just change it to like 200, for example. So it's a little bit smaller, looks a little bit better. And I should be able to bring my camera back. There we go. So now we can add in an x-axis and a y-axis. So let's say that we have our x-axis just like that. And we can add in our y-axis. There we go. Give that a quick save. And now you can see we have our values on our x-axis and our values on our y-axis, but these are not our dates. We want them to show up as our date. So on our x-axis here, what we can do is we can say that we're going to have a data key. And this will say, hey, what value should I use in this particular instance? And that is going to be our date. So now you can see these are replaced with that string that I specified as my date. I can also, for example, come in here and give it a name such as date. And now it's going to be specified that this is the date, but this is really not important because we're not showing that anywhere on our graph. So we can leave this off, keep it on there. It doesn't really matter. We'll just remove it because we technically don't need it. Now we also want to show our tooltip as well. So we can come in here and say tooltip just like that, close it off. And now if I hover over one of these elements, you'll see I get a tooltip that's giving me the actual label here for the date. And it's also giving me the specific value. Now we can do a lot of changes to fine tune exactly what this looks like. For example, on our line, we're going to give this a type here of monotone. Just like that. So that's just going to make it so that we have a curve in our graph instead of straight lines. If you wanted the straight lines, you could keep it with the straight lines by doing this. It doesn't really matter. I kind of like the curvy look, so we're just going to come in here with monotone, just give it that curvy or more modern look. We can also give it a name. For example, this will be called total sales, and that'll give a graph an actual name that will show up on it. And then instead of actually hard coding what the width and height are going to be, instead I want this to be responsive to fill its entire container. So what we can do is we can use a responsive container, just like that. Move our line chart inside of here. And now this is going to responsively fill the specific size we give it. So we can set this as a width of 100%, and we can give it a min height of, for example, 300. And now it's going to essentially fill that specific size based on the container it's inside of. As you can see, this container, it's filling the full width, but we want to put it inside of a card. So let's go ahead and on our page, add this inside of a card. So our card is pretty much going to be the same as this card that we have down here. I'm just going to copy this over, paste it down. Obviously, our body section is going to be replaced with this chart. Let's get that. And our title is going to say something like total sales or whatever. It doesn't really matter. So there we go. Now you can see that this is put inside of a specific card, and we can obviously put this inside of a column grid as well. So we can come in here, make sure I copy that div down to here. And we want to make sure we remove all of that. There we go. So now we can give it a save, and now you can see that it's only filling a specific size. Now I want these to be a little bit wider than our top cards. So I'm just going to change this from medium to large and remove the ability to have 3 columns. So it's going to be full width like this, but on a larger screen size, as you can see, it goes down to half width. Also, I'm probably going to add a little bit of margin on side of here. So we'll say margin top is going to be 8, just like that, just to space these out from one another. And now you can see we have our entire section showing up with our total sales, and we have our date showing up, and this looks relatively good. We just have a few other minor changes because technically these values are currencies. They're like dollar amounts. So we should probably format them as dollar amounts. So on our y-axis, we can specify something called the tick formatter. This is a function that takes in our tick value, and that's just the value that shows up over here. So 28, 21, 14, and so on. And all we want to do is call the format currency function that we've already created. This is just a function that formats things as a dollar amount. So now you can see we get that dollar sign in front and it looks really good. We can do the same thing for our tooltip because this should say $25 or $5. So on our tooltip, we want to specify what the formatter is going to be. That's going to take in our value just like this, and we want to call that format currency on our specific value. Now we are getting a TypeScript error, and that's because this value has some kind of weird type. We know that this is going to be a number, so we can just say that this is going to be a number, manually casting that inside of TypeScript. So now when I hover over this, you can see it formats this as a currency as well. Now pretty much the last thing that we have left to do is just to format this with styling. So we'll just come over here and actually do all of our different styling. For example, our Cartesian grid, we want to change this to have a stroke here, which is going to be a slightly different color to it. And we're going to use the styles that we already have defined inside of our CSS variables. So we can use the muted color from our CSS variables. And if I save and I bring this over so it's a little bit easier to see, you can see that this Cartesian grid is now much more muted and not nearly as bright and in your face. We're going to do that for all of our different styles. So we can come here for our x-axis and do the exact same thing. But instead of being muted here, this is going to be our primary color. I'm going to do the exact same thing for my y-axis. It's going to be that primary color as well. So we'll come in here, fix all that spacing. And then lastly, I want my line to be that exact same primary color as well. So now if I bring this over, you can see we have these much darker, blacker colors, and you can see we have the black line showing up as well. Now the final thing I want to do is on our line, I want to remove the dot. So I can just say dot equals false. And now you can see that it removes the dots that were showing up. Just because if we have a lot of data points, those dots are going to be kind of overwhelming. Now the next step is to actually make it so we can pass data into here. So I'm going to pass in a data prop, and this is going to be our orders by day chart, just like that. And these are going to be our props. So let's set a type for this. Type is going to be that equal to, and this is going to take in data, and this data is going to be an object array. And inside of here, we're going to have two different values. We're going to have the specific date that this happened, which is going to be a string. And then we're going to have our total sales number, which is going to be a number. So this data we can remove now that we no longer need it. And instead, what I need to do is I need to make it so that I have date being passed in. First, I need to make this an object. There we go. So first of all, I need to use date for my data key, which I'm already doing. And then instead of value, I need to use total sales right here. So now that'll actually fix it, but we're not passing in any data. We need to pass some data in. So I'll just pass in some placeholder data to make sure that this is working. We have our date, which we're just going to say hi. It doesn't really matter what this is, with a value of 12. And remember, this is total sales instead. And we're going to do the exact same thing with a date that says buy. And we're going to come in here with a total sales of 10. So there we go. So now if we look at our actual chart, you can see it goes from 12 to 10, and we have high and buy being listed down here. So at least everything is working and rendering out. All we need to do next is to fetch the data. And this is just for the most basic form of this chart. We're obviously going to get much more complex with filtering and so on. So let's make this side of our screen quite a bit bigger to work with. And if we scroll up to the very top of our page, you notice we have these functions like get sales data and so on that get all the information that we actually need. So what I can do is I can come in here and I can say const chart data is going to be equal to awaiting calling db.order. And I want to essentially find a bunch of different information about our orders. So I'm going to assign many different orders just like this. We can pass in everything that we need to get from here. So for example, what I want to select from this is going to be the created at field, because I want to determine when this order was created. And I want to also get what price was paid for this order in cents. So we can get that information. I then need to specify a where clause because I obviously don't want to get every single order that I have. I want to limit it to like the last 7 days, last 30 days, or a custom field. So here I want to essentially have a start date and an end date. So we'll say created after, which is going to be a date or null. I'll make it so I don't have to pass this in. So it's going to be an optional field just like that. And I'm actually not going to make it optional. I'm going to make it so that you have to pass something in, but you can pass in null if you want. And we'll do created before, which is also going to be a date or null. So now what I can do is I can determine what those fields are by trying to filter this, because I can filter on the created at field. And I could say, hey, you know what? It has to be greater than whatever my created after is. So I could say like that. And it also has to be less than my created before, but these can be null. So I need to dynamically create this information. So I can say created at query is going to be equal to, and this is a specific type. So I'm going to say Prisma dot, make sure I import Prisma, And this is going to be an order where input, just like that. And I want to get it for just the created at portion. That essentially gives me the type of this object right here. So I can change this, paste that into here, and you'll notice I no longer get any errors, but I need to specify what this looks like. So as you can see in here, I have the option to do like greater than and so on. So by default, I'm going to set this to an empty object. And then if my created after is not equal to null, so if it exists like this, then what I can do is I can say that my created after query, or created at query, sorry, dot greater than is going to be greater than or equal to my created after. There we go. So I'm saying now if I have a field for created after, it must be greater than or equal to that. And here we'll do the same thing with created before. This is going to be less than or equal to that created before field, just like that. So now I have that where query showing up. I can also order these. So I can say order by, and I want to order them by the created at field. So we can say created at in the ascending order, just like that. Now, in order to make this query a little bit more efficient, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it inside of a promise.all. I'm going to pass it an array with both of these queries. So I'm going to copy over this first query, and then I'm going to copy over this second query, just so they run in parallel. I can await that, and I can say that we're going to get our data and our chart data, just like that. And now I can remove this since I've copied it up. And as you can see, I'm getting those two pieces of information. And I need to return some form of chart data, but I'm going to do some massaging to this data because it's currently not in a very useful form. So right now, let's just say that we're going to return null here. I'll come in and fix this in just a little bit. So we'll say that's null for now. And the first thing I need to do is convert this data, like I've said. And this data right now is just giving me a bunch of orders, but essentially I want to group all my orders by the day that they are being ordered on. That's the most basic date form that we can have. So what I can do here is first get an array of every single day that's from our created before to our created after. I'm sorry, from our created after to our created before. So what we can do is we can create an interval, and this interval comes from datefns. And then once we create an interval, we can use another function, which is going to be each day of interval. And this is going to give me an array with one day object per day that's within this interval. So this interval takes a before and after. So we can pass it in our created before and our created after as well. Now, technically these should be swapped. So it should go created after, then created before, just like that. And since these can be null, I obviously need to specify what an actual date is going to be. So if my created after is null, then what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to get whatever the earliest order in my entire array is. So that's going to be, since they're already ordered in order, it's just going to be the very first one. So it's going to be chart data of 0, and I want to get that created at field. So this is going to get the earliest possible date that we've created. And here, I'm going to set this to a new date by default. So if we don't have an after date, it's just going to be everything up to the most current date. And if we don't have a created after date, it's going to give me the earliest possible field that has been created. And I want this to be at the start of the day. So I'm going to use the start of day function, just like that, just to make sure it's always going to be at the very start of the day. There we go. So this is going to give me essentially a day array, just like that. And this is just an array with dates for each day in between these two different intervals. Now what I want to do is I want to convert this to a format that I can actually use for totaling up my orders. So I'm going to turn this into a map, just like that. I'm going to take each day, just like here. And I'm going to return to me an object that's going to have a date, which is going to be my day, but I want to format this as a string. So I want to use some type of format date function. So there is one built into datefns, but I'm actually going to create my own format date function. And we're going to pass it in the day right here. We'll just call this date actually, so it's a little bit easier to work with. And then what we can do down below is we can say that we're going to have our total sales. I'm going to set this to 0. So by default, we're essentially creating an empty array that has the date and total sales, which is the exact information we need to pass into here, but it's defaulting all of our total sales to 0 at the beginning. Now let's go ahead and create that format date function. If we come over into our lib, we have this formatters file where we can create a format date function. We already have one for format date time. So I'm just going to copy this down. We're going to say format date. This is going to be a date formatter, and we can just remove the time section from here, and that's going to give me a formatted date. There we go. So now inside of here, I can just implement or import that from my own formatters, and that's going to give me a perfectly formatted date. And now we can use this day array down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my chart data, I'm going to reduce it down. So I'm going to call reduce. I'm going to pass it in some type of function that's going to do some type of reducing. And the initial data that I'm going to pass in is my day array. So by default, if there's no chart data, I'm essentially returning this day array, which is just 0 sales for every single day in my list. So everything is defaulted to 0. And inside here, I'm getting my total data as well as each individual order that's being printed out. And all I want to do is just add each order into the day array for the day that it should specifically be for. So what I can do is I can get the formatted date. So we can say formatted date is equal to calling format date and passing it in my order.created@. So this is going to get what date we are on, and that date is exactly the date field in our day array. So we can say day array.find for each day. If my day.date is equal to the formatted date, then we know that this is the current entry we should be working on. So this is our entry, just like that. There we go. If our entry is null, then we have some type of problem and we should just not return anything. We shouldn't add anything. So we're just going to return our data as is. We're not going to modify anything at all with our data. Otherwise, if our entry is not equal to null, we want to add this to our data. So I'm just going to say entry dot total sales. And I want to add to that my order dot price paid in cents divided by 100 because I want this to be in dollars and this is in cents. So we're just converting from cents to dollars, and then we can return our data. So all I'm doing with this reduce function is essentially taking all of my orders, totaling up all the sales for each individual day and saving that into my array. So now it's going to give me the total sales on each individual day with that formatted string as my actual string. And that's going to get me all my data I need. So we can come all the way down to where we're calling that get sales data, and we can pass it in our starting date and our ending date. So let's come in here and by default, let's just say that we're going to get a new date just like that. And I'm going to call the sub days function. I'm going to pass it in here 7 or something like that. So we can say sub days is going to be a function. And then I'm also going to pass in new date just like that. So essentially I'm going backwards 7 days and also using the current date. And technically if I want to just do the previous 7 days, this would need to be 6 because it's going to be the 6 previous days plus the current day. That's going to be all my sales data. And now I can pass that into my chart. So here I can say sales data dot chart data just like that. Give it a quick save. And now you'll notice if I expand this up, you can see that we actually have our chart data showing up for the last 7 days. And if I wanted to show it for the last, for example, 17 days, you can now see I have that showing up for the last 17 days. Most days are 0 because there aren't any sales on most days, but you can see some days there are a spike in sales, $85 and $449. Those are what I have saved in my test database. Now let's go ahead and try to do this for multiple different charts. We have 3 different charts we want to look at, so we can get kind of a wide variety of different types of charting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll all the way down here where we have our card that we're rendering out. I'm going to bring this out into its own component. So we'll say function chart card, paste that down. We're just going to return this, and it's going to take in 2 props. We're going to have our title and our children, just like that. And we're going to say this is our chart card props. Chart card props is equal to a title, which is a string. And then we have the children, which is a React node. There we go. That's all we need to do for this section. And then down here, this can be children, and this right here can be title. There we go. Now we have our chart card all the way up here. Where we remove that information, we can just render out a chart card, paste in what our chart is going to be rendered as, and we paste in our title, which is total sales. And you can see that we have our chart showing up on the right-hand side. And if I were to copy this, paste it down, we can actually render out multiple different charts, as you can see side by side. So let's go ahead and create the next chart that we want to work on. This chart is going to be very similar to the current chart we have. I'm just going to copy over this file. I'm going to rename this file, and this one is going to be users by day chart. There we go. And when we can come in here and we can say, instead of orders by day, this is going to be users by day. There we go. And instead of total sales, this is going to be total users that we're going to be passing in. And this chart is going to be a bar chart instead of a line chart, just so we can look around at what the differences between these different charts are. So here's our bar chart. And instead of a line, we're going to have a bar. So we'll come in here with our bar, and this is going to be replaced with bar instead of line. Now, if we just give that a save, and we're going to bring over that users by day chart, we're going to render that inside of our page here. Make sure we import that. And obviously we're going to need to pass in some different data. I'm just going to use some placeholder data for this. So we can come in here and let's see what we called these things. We have date and total sales. So I'm going to say our date is going to be day 1, and we're going to have total users is going to be 10 or 12, doesn't really matter. I'm just going to copy this down a couple times. There we go. We're going to have day 2 and day 3. We'll say day 3 is 0, and this will just be 5. Doesn't really matter. So we have some placeholder data we can use. Now inside of here, obviously total sales should say total users, just like this. This will say total customers, or actually we'll just make it say new customers because these are our new customers. There's no dot field and we don't care about this type field, so we can remove that. And now if we give that a quick save and I actually expand this, we can see what this bar chart looks like. And you can notice we have our bar chart and it looks relatively good. We have day 1, day 2, day 3, and we're showing those different information. Now we don't want to use format currency. Obviously we don't have a currency here. This should say format number instead. So we'll say format number, which is a formatter that we've already created. And we can get rid of this currency formatter up there. There we go. So now when we hover over this, it's formatting as a number instead of a currency. So this is how many new customers we have on each day. But you'll notice this background hover is kind of a really in-your-face color. I want to minimize that a little bit. So on our tooltip, we're going to specify our cursor. And our cursor here is going to have a fill. And this is going to be a fill that is going to use that muted color. So we're going to use a muted CSS variable, just like that. Now, if I give that a save and I hover, you can see it's a much more not quite in your face hovering effect, which is, I think, a little bit nicer looking for our application. Now, since bar charts are relatively similar to an actual line chart, we don't need to make any other changes to our chart. It's pretty much the same as before. All we need to do is make sure we fetch our actual data. So up here, instead of this saying total sales, this will say new customers. There we go. And our data is going to be coming from our user data.chart data. We just need to make sure we export this from our function. So just like we did with get sales data, I want to do essentially the same thing. So I'm going to copy over a lot of this code. First, I'm going to copy over the props we're going to pass in. So in our user data, we're going to pass in those 2 different props. I'm also going to pass in this created at query because it's going to be exactly the same. We're, again, filtering by a specific date range, just like that. I'm going to be getting my chart data from here, which is going to be coming in from a DB query. And here, I just want to find when my users were created. So we can say user. I want to make sure I call the find many method. So we'll say find many. And then I want to select specifically the created at field and true, because I want to figure out how many were created on each individual day. My where clause is going to be that created at query that we just created, that same exact thing we copied over. So there we go. And we need to make sure that this is a user where input instead of an order, since we're on a user query. And then again, I want to order these by that created at field in the ascending order. So that is getting us our chart data. Now we just need to make sure we format it properly. And again, we can copy over a lot of what we did up here. We want to get that day array for each individual day. That's the exact same code. So we're just going to get our day array. And then we need to make sure we reduce it down. And this again is going to be very similar code. So I'll copy this over. Chart data, just like that, copy that down, put the comma in here. And all I need to do here is I'm going to have a user instead of an order. I want to get the created at date for that user, check to see if we have an entry. And if we do, I want to take my total users. This should say total users. There we go. And I want to just increment this by 1. So total users plus equals 1. So just add 1 to my total users if I have a user for that specific field. And that's going to be all the data that we need to get from here. Now, if I scroll all the way down, you can see we need to specify our array. So let's come in here with an array, and we're going to say that this is going to be for the last 6 days is what we're going to render out. And we'll scroll down, we'll expand this so we can see what our chart looks like. And you'll notice for the last 6 days, we had 1 new customer on the 13th, but no new customers any other day. If I change this to like the last 16 days, you can now see we had 4 customers this day, 1 customer this day, and no customers on all of the other days that were new. Now that's 2 of our charts done. We're going to be adding a 3rd and final pie chart before we start going into the more complex things that we can do to make these a little bit more interactable instead of just hard-coded data. So we're going to come over here and we're going to copy over our chart just to create a second one. And this second chart that we're going to be creating is revenue. Make sure I spell that properly. There we go. By product chart. There we go. So this is just going to be a pie chart that shows the revenue for each individual product in a pie chart. So here, instead of a bar chart, we're going to have a pie chart, just like that. And down here, pie chart. There we go. We don't really need to worry about a grid-based system. So all the grid stuff we can completely remove. And instead of a bar here, this is going to be an individual pie that's coming from that library. Now, instead of passing the data to our pie chart, we actually pass it down to this pie component instead. And then we need to specify what our data key is going to be. This is going to be our revenue. So up here, we're going to have our revenue, and we're going to have the name of the product because this is no longer by days. So we can rename this to revenue by product chart, just like that. Put props at the end of it, and same thing up here, revenue by product chart props. There we go. Now all we need to do is make sure everything else is correct. So our key here is going to be our revenue. We also need to have a name key, and that's just going to be our name. So this is going to be the name of the thing. This is going to be the value for the specific thing. We don't need to worry about this name here. Instead of a stroke, this is actually going to be a fill, since it's going to be a filled in pie chart. And then we need to specify what we want our label to look like, because by default, our label is going to be our revenue number, but instead we want this to be our actual product name. So this is going to take in our item just like this, and we want to get the name property from our item. So if we give that a quick save and we actually render out this chart, we should see that it'll show up as long as we pass in some information. Also, this I'm going to use the format currency function just because this revenue number is actually a dollar amount. So format currency makes the most sense. So let's go ahead and actually render out this chart. We'll go into our page here. We'll copy this down. This is our revenue by product chart. And I'm going to pass in some hard-coded data. So we're going to say name is going to be P1 for product 1, and we'll say value is 200. And this is actually revenue. There we go. And I'll copy this down a second time. There we go. It'll say P2 with a value of, let's say, 500. Give that a quick save. Expand this over here, and now you can see we have our chart showing up, and you can see we have the label P1, which has a value of 200, P2 has a value of 500, so that is all looking exactly like we want. We should just probably make this say something like revenue per product. And we'll actually change this to by product instead. There we go, just so it's a little bit easier to read and reason with. And as you can see, that looks really great. And if we were to change one of these values to like 600, you can see our graph changes. So now P1 is 600, P2 is 500. That looks really good. Now all we need to do is make it so that this chart is actually dynamic with our real life data. So here, remove all of this. We're going to have our product data.chart data, which we're going to make sure we get from here. We're going to pass in all of the information here. So like, let's say we're going to do it for the last 7 days. And now up in this get product data function, we just want to take the exact same information. So same exact props. I'm going to copy those over just like we were doing before. I'm going to get the same exact where clause because we make sure we only filter if we pass in that information just like that. So then what I can do is I can come in here, create a variable for our chart data. And this one's actually going to be quite a bit simpler. So I want to get by my products. I want to do a find many. And this find many, I want to select specifically the name field. And I also want to specify that I want to select all of the different orders. And for each order, I want to specify that I want to get the price paid in cents, just like that. And I only want to get the orders that are within a specific field. So created at query, just like that. And this should say order where. There we go. So now what I'm doing with this specific query is I'm saying, hey, give me all of my different products and also give me all of the different orders for those products, but only give me the orders within a specific date range query. Once I have that done, I can actually pass down my chart data, which is just going to be mapping over this chart data and turning it into the correct format. So in here, I'm going to have an individual product. So what I can do is I can return a new object, which has a name, which is my product.name, just like that. Make sure that everything is closed off properly. There should be a comma right here. There we go. And then the other thing I need in here is my revenue. So we can have revenue just like that. And that's coming from my product.orders. And I want to just sum these all together. So I can do a quick sum for each order. I'm going to start this out at 0, just like that. I just want to return sum plus order.price paid in cents. And I want to divide that by 100 so I can get a dollar amount instead. So I'm pretty much just taking the data I get from my database and converting it to a function that's easy to put into our actual map. So now if we just bring this over, you can see that I have my revenue for product 1, which is 85, and product 2 has $0 over this span of time. If I were to come in here with like $16, for example, you can now see that this is actually showing up properly. We have product 1 and we have product 2. Now, if I wanted, I could actually hide product 2 from here when there is no data for it during that period. So what I could do is come all the way up to where we're getting our product data, make this a little bigger so it's easier to read. And I could just add on a quick filter onto the end of this so we can filter each one of our things. So this is going to be our products. And I actually need to add this filter onto the correct location, which is going to be here. There we go. So we're going to filter on each product just like that. And we can say where the product.revenue is greater than 0. So now if I bring this back over, you can see that's only going to have product 1 showing up with that $85 amount. And if I were to modify this to have a larger range, you can now see that it's going to show 2 different products inside this section, and they're going to have a dollar amount for each one because they both have sales during that period. Now we had a little bit of a weird glitch. If we just refresh our page, you'll notice these tooltips properly show up. There's no 0 showing up in the tooltip. That was just something to do with the way refreshing was working. Now the next thing I want to work on is adding a button so we can filter each one of these charts based on a specific date range instead of having to hard code this inside of our code. So in order to do that, let's actually maximize our code section because we really want to focus on what our code is going to look like. And this chart card is where all of that is going to go. So inside of here, we have our card header and we have our title, but we obviously want to have a button off to the side as well. So inside of this card header, I'm going to add a div with some classes. We're going to add a class of flex, a gap of 4. We're going to justify space between, and we're going to put our items in the center. So we're going to have our title on one end of this, and on the other end, we're going to be adding essentially an entire drop-down menu. So we're going to make sure we get that from our own components right here. We have our drop-down menu. This is part of shadcn. We need our drop-down menu trigger. Make sure we import that correctly. I'm going to specify that that is as child because inside of here, I'm just going to render out a button. This button is going to be an outline button, just like that. Make sure I import this from that components. There we go. We have it from our components. And inside of this button, it'll just say something like range, whatever. We'll say select range. We'll come in here and figure out what this actual text is going to be in a little bit. So now we can specify our drop-down menu content, just like that. And inside of here, we need to have a drop-down menu item. So we can get each one of our items, and our items will say something like 7 days or something like that. In our case, let's make it say last 7 days. So just by doing this, if we expand over here, you'll notice we now have our button, and our button has the last 7 days option in it, but we want to have an option for each of the different day periods that we can select. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new file inside of our lib folder. So inside of here, I'm going to add a new file, and I'm going to call this range options.ts. And this is where I'm going to specify all my code for my different range options I'm going to use all over the place. So we're going to say export a constant, and this is going to be called range options. This is going to be essentially a hard-coded data, which is going to be an array. And actually, instead of an array, I'm going to make this an object where each key is essentially going to be the unique identifier. So we can have, for example, last 7 days as our identifier here. And this will be an object that'll have a label, which will be last 7 days, just like this. It's going to have a start date, which is just going to be essentially creating a new date, just like that. We're going to subtract some days from here, and we're going to subtract 6 days specifically. And that's because the way that our filtering and everything works is that this is actually going to be the previous 6 days, plus we're going to be including the current day as well. We're going to specify an end date. So we can say here, end date. We could pass in a new date just like this to say it's the current date. Or what we could do is we could pass in null to also indicate that this is going to be the current date. Either one's going to be fine. It really doesn't matter. Then what we can do is make sure that this is also start of day as well, just so we always know that this starts at the very beginning of the day. So we'll come in here, start of day, just like that. And now what we essentially have is a filter for the last 7 days. Now I can copy this down and do it for the last 30 days as well. So we could say last 30 days, and this is going to be subtracting 29 days. Again, because we have that extra day from whatever the current day is. I'm going to do this a couple more times. For example, we're going to have 90 days. We're going to have 365 days to essentially give us an entire year. And then finally, we're going to have an all time, which is just going to give us all of the data in the entire database. So this will be last 90 days where we subtract 89 days. We're going to have last 365 where we subtract 364 days. And then for all time, our start date is just going to be null to indicate that we're going to start at the earliest possible time available. So we'll say all time just like this. Now you may notice this data actually lines up really well with what we've already created. If we go to our page, you may remember that all of these require us to pass in a start date and an end date. And if we come over here, you can see we have a start date and end date for each one of these. And the label is just something that we can print out inside of our chart. So all the way down here, we can essentially loop through each one of these and pass in whatever the label is right here. So we have our range options. I'm going to map through each option just like this. I'm going to return this drop-down menu item. The key inside of here is going to be based on whatever the actual key of the object is. And since this is an object, we need to call object.entries to be able to map over this. And this is going to give me essentially an array, and that array is going to have a key and a value. So this key right here is the key. That's just going to be like last _7 days, for example. And then here, we're going to have our value dot, and you can see we can get the label directly from here. So now if we expand this and we look and I select my range, you can see we get a range for each one of these specific options that I created, and I could add more or less options. But right now, clicking on these does absolutely nothing. I need to add in some functionality. Well, to do that, I essentially need to add in an on-click listener to each one of these different items for whenever I click on this item. For example, I could just say console.log hi for now to say that I've clicked on this item. But doing that requires me to be inside of a client component, and this component that I'm inside of is a server component. So I need to remove all of this code and put it somewhere else. So let's go inside of admin in our components, and we'll create a chart card.tsx, and we'll just paste this into here and make sure that we import everything that we need. So we're going to get our card, we're going to get our card header, get the title, get all of this information, make sure we get our button as well, and our content. And then finally, our item. And I believe this card content is the last thing that we need to import. And then we need to import the range options. There we go. Lastly, if we import React Node, that fixes that. Give this a save. And over here, where we have these chart cards, let's just make sure we import these chart cards. I need to make sure, though, that I export it. So here, export our chart card. And here, I can actually import that. So that cleans up those errors. And if I give that a save, you can see that I just need to make sure I actually set this new file I created to a client component. And now you can see that I have all my different charts showing up. And when I click on these, it's printing out hi into the console. As you can see right here, it's printing out the text of hi. You can kind of ignore these errors. These are just part of the rechart library, just some stuff that is written with how the code is written. Ignore it. It doesn't really matter at all. There's not actually any errors. So now what's going to happen is whenever I click on one of these different options, I want to call a function. We're just going to say function set range, just like that. It's going to take in a range, and this range is actually, I'm going to make sure it's a type directly from these options. So I'm going to say that this is a key of the type of range options. So if I hover over this type, you can see it must be one of those different keys that we specified. Now inside of here, I can use that information how I want. So what I can do is I can say set range, pass that in here, and I could pass it in my key just like that. And right now, this key is technically just a string, even though we know it's essentially one of these different labels. So we can cast that to the key of type of range options, just like that. So we just manually cast that so that we are smarter than TypeScript. We know that this has those correct option values. Now, the way that I want to set this information inside of our page is going to be using URL parameters. So we can use the use search params function, and we can use the use router hook as well, just like this. So we can say const router is equal to that, const search params is equal to that. And now we can, for example, come in here and say router dot push, and we can push in a brand new value for our router, which are based on our search parameters and so on. So let's get our new parameters. That's just going to be a new URL search params where we pass in our existing search parameters. So this is going to take all the search parameters we have in our URL and give us a brand new params to work with. Then what we can do is we can come in here and we can set a specific value right here. Doesn't matter what this is called. We'll just call this query. We'll change this in a little bit, and we'll set that to whatever our range is. And then we want to push that to our router. Well, to do that, we need to get the path name for our current path. So we'll say use path name, just like that. And what we can do down inside of our push is just combine together the string for our path name, followed by a question mark, followed by our params dot to string. There we go. Then lastly, I can come in here and I can say that I want my scroll value to be false. And it's just going to make sure it doesn't scroll back to the top of my page whenever I do this. So now if I click on select range and I click last 7 days, you can see in my URL, I get question mark query equals last underscore 7 days. If I change this to 90 days, you can see I get last 90 days. Now the one problem is that each one of our ranges is going to be on the same query param. As you can see, this changes the same query param. So we want a different query parameter for each one of our different charts. So we need to pass that in as part of our actual props. So we'll have a query key here, and this query key is just going to be a string. So now here, I can specify my query key is what I'm going to change. So now if I pass in a query key here, for example, the query key for this one can just be set to new customers range. Make sure I spell that properly. And also I should make sure that I actually pass this into my chart instead of my chart. I need to pass it into the card here. So there's that query key. We'll paste this down for both of these. So this one is the new customer one. This one is going to be my total sales. So we'll call it total sales range. And this one we'll call product, or we'll call it revenue by product range. There we go. So now if I just essentially remove all my query parameters, so we start over a fresh slate. If I change this one to 7 days, you can see my total sales range is last 7 days. New customers, let's change that to 90. You can see new customers range is set to last 90 days. And whenever I update these, you can see it's updating inside of my URL as well. So all we need to do is make sure we use these range values in all the different places that we need them. So let's go all the way back to our main page, which we're already on. And if we scroll up inside of our admin dashboard, we can actually take in some search params here. And if we type this out, we can type out our search params as well. And this search params is going to be an object which is going to have a search parameter for each one of these. So we're going to have our total sales range, which is a string, and this is going to be optional. And we can paste this down because we're going to have our new customers range, and we're also going to have our revenue by product range just like that. And we can get these up here. So we can destructure search params to get these specific values. Our total sales range, we can get our new customers range, and our revenue by product range. Give that a quick save, and essentially we have all of our different search params, and here's the typing for those. And we can use those search params to essentially look up what the actual value is going to be, because inside of our range options, we know that if it's last 7 days, this is the information we want to use. Same thing here with last 30 days, and so on. So I'm going to create a function that lets us do that lookup. We'll call it getRangeOption, just like that. And it's going to return to us one of these different options based on the string we pass in. So this getRangeOption is going to take in a range, and it's going to be a string, just like that. And then what we want to do is you just want to say that we're going to look inside of our range options object, and we're going to use that range query right here. And we're going to manually cast this to key of type of range option. Otherwise, it won't let us actually do this. And then we're going to return that value. So calling getRangeOption is essentially going to return to us one of these different values, or it could be undefined. So let's go ahead and we're going to export this function just like that. And now what I want to do is go back to our main page that we were just working on, and we can actually get that range information for each one of these different sections. So we can say here that our sales data range is going to be equal to calling getRangeOption, passing in our total sales range just like that. Now let's rename this here to actually say total sales range option. And you'll notice that this is actually giving me an error saying string or undefined cannot be passed in. That's because we want to make sure that this could also be undefined. So let's make that optional so it can be undefined, because this could also be undefined. So this right here is going to be one of those different values, or it's going to be undefined. Now, since we're not currently checking for undefined, we want to go back into the range options, and if our range is equal to null, then we're just going to return. So we return absolutely nothing. That's how we can make sure that this could also be undefined at the very end here. So if it is undefined, let's specify a default value. Our default value is going to be last 7 days. For our total sales, we're going to either show whatever the option they've selected is, or we'll default it to the last 7 days. So now what we can do is we can use the start and end date here. So we can say dot start date, come into here, pass in the end date, and now we've essentially made it so we can filter this information. So give that a quick save, and now you'll notice right now it's showing me the last 7 days. Change it to 30 days, you can see it's showing me last 30 days. Same thing here with last 90, and if I change this to 365, it's showing me that, and we can go back to 7 days as well. Now I also want to change this label right here to whatever the current label is. So down here in my chart card, I can pass down the selected range label, which is a prop we're going to create, and that's just going to be the label from whatever the option we have is. So on our chart card, let's get our selected range label, which is just a string. Get that inside of here as well. And then right here where we're saying select range, we're going to pass it in whatever that label is for our range. So now, right now, nothing is being passed in, but we can fix that in a little bit. It looks like this is selected range label. There we go. So you can see this first one is passing in. And as I change this, you can see it's properly updating. We just need to make sure we pass it into these other chart cards as well. So let's make sure we get the range option for each one of them. So we'll paste this down. This one right here is going to be our new customers range option, and this is new customers. We'll default that to 7 days as well. And then we're going to come in here with our revenue by product option, and this is a range option, equals get range option, pass it in our revenue by product range, and this one is going to default to all time if we don't have a specific date range set. So now we can use both of these down here to get the start date, and we can get the end date for that one. Same thing here. Start date, end date, there we go. And this one is going to be for our revenue instead of our customers. And then down here, we need to modify what the selected range is going to be. So I'm going to paste this down for both of them. This one is going to be for our revenue by product, and this one is going to be for our new customers range option. There we go. Give those a quick save, and let's look at our actual result. You'll see that as I filter these, the actual values inside of this section has changed. Here's 90 days. This one I can change to 7 days, or I can change it to 90 days. As you can see, everything is filtering properly. And if I refresh my page, the most important part is since all of this is stored in the URL, you can see it all shows up here properly. So let's remove these URL params for now, just to get back to a blank slate where we have all of our default values showing up. And let's go ahead and actually make this a little bit more complex by adding in the ability to do a custom date range as well. So to do that, we need to have an option for that inside of our chart card. So here we have our drop-down items for each one of our individual range options. I'm going to come in here with a menu separator, just like this. So we have a separator between our custom and non-custom option. And this is going to be a drop-down sub menu. So we can say drop-down menu sub, just like this. And inside this sub menu, we have a drop-down sub trigger. There we go. And this trigger is just going to say custom, just like that. And then we need to have our content. So we'll say drop down menu sub content, just like that. And for now, I'll just have this say text hi. So now what I can do is I can expand this, give this a quick refresh. And if I open this up, you can see if I hover over custom, you can see I get that hi being printed out. So at least we can see now we have the option for a custom one. I just need to add in that fancy date picker. And this is actually really easy since we're using shadcn. So inside of here, I'm going to create a div that's going to be wrapping this entire thing. And inside of here, I'm going to be putting that calendar component directly from shadcn. And inside of here, I'm going to specify the mode to be a range. So we can have a range date selector. I'm going to set that we're going to have some disabled dates. I'm going to be disabling it whenever there's a date that is after the current date, because obviously I can't select dates that are in the future. Then after that, I want to specify that we're going to have a selected date. And this is going to be equal to a variable called date range, which we're going to create some state for. So we'll say const date range set date range. There we go. That is equal to use state. And that use state is going to be equal to the date range type, just like that, date range. There we go. Make sure I import that type. Perfect. And we need to make sure we get this from use state. And this can also be undefined, just like that. Now we can even specify some default values. So I can come in here. I can say that we're going to have a default from field. And this default from field is going to be sub days, new date, 29. So it's just going to be 30 days ago. And the to date here is just going to be the current date. So that's going to be what our default is going to look like for this. So now we have that selected date down here. We can also specify what the month is going to be opened as. So we can take our date range dot, and I want to get the from month. So this is going to default to the current month inside of our date range. And then finally, we're going to say on select, I want to set my date range. There we go. And I want to specify that we can have 2 months shown at the exact same time by saying number of months is 2. Now, if I give that a quick save and we just open one of these up, and we hover over custom, you notice we get this entire date range calendar over on the right hand side, which I can modify however I want, and it'll do all of these different things, which looks really, really great and is super amazing. And the nice thing is every time I change it, it's updating this date range variable, so we can use that whenever we click a submit button. So let's add in a submit button. So we'll come in here with a button just like that, that'll say submit, and we'll add a bunch of different information to this. For example, we're going to disable this if our date range is equal to null, just like that. I also want this to fill the full width, so we'll say class name wfull to fill the full width. And whenever I click on this, I want to do something in particular. But instead of putting on click on this button, I'm actually going to put it somewhere else, because right now what happens if I click on submit, you'll notice it doesn't actually close out of this custom field. I can click it all I want, but it's not going to close this drop-down menu. So instead, I need to wrap this inside of a drop-down menu item, because whenever you click on a drop-down menu item, it actually closes the menu. So now if I hover this and I hover this button and click, you notice it closes out of that menu. Now you will notice though, when I hover over this button, I kind of get this weird hover background. To fix that, I can just come in here and say class name is going to be hover BG auto, and that's just going to remove that background on hover. And as you can see, that works. And when I click the submit button, you can see it properly closes. So that is working great. I just need to add an on click to this to actually set the specific range. So what I can do is if my date range is equal to null, just return, because obviously I don't want to do anything. Otherwise, I actually want to make this work. So what I can do inside of here is I can call set range, and I can pass it in my date range. Now I probably want to move this on click to my actual button. So I'm going to do that. I'm just going to remove that code, move it onto my button instead. There we go. Fix all of that, give it a quick save. And the reason I'm doing that is because my button is able to be disabled while this is not able to be disabled. So now we can set the range based on a date range. So up here, I'm going to pass in my range as either a range option or as a date range. So it's going to be one of these two different types. So if my range, my type of range is equal to a string, well then I know that it is currently a type of range option. Otherwise, I know that it is a date range. So what I can do is I can move this up to here. So we're setting my query for this specific case where it's a range. Otherwise, I want to set some other queries for if we're in a date range. So I'm going to copy this params and do the same thing essentially. But here, instead of using my query key just like that, what I want to do is I want to add the from key to the end of it. And I want to get my range dot from. I want to do the exact same thing for 2, but I want to get my range dot to. So I'm just adding 2 more parameters to get my from and to field. I want to convert these to an ISO string, just like that. Same thing here, dot to ISO string. There we go. And you can see that these are currently nullable. So what I want to do is just add in a check that if my range dot from is equal to null or my range dot to is equal to null, then I want to just return and not do anything at all. And let's just make sure I set that like this. So now if I'm in a custom one, I'm setting a to and from field. Otherwise, I'm setting what my current range is. Now I also want to make sure if I'm using a custom one, I delete my old key. So I'm going to say delete my query key. So I no longer have that. And up here, I want to do the exact same thing. Params.delete my query key, but I want to delete it for the from and to properties. Essentially, I just want to make sure those old information is no longer in my URL. So here, in the case of custom, I'm passing a from and to key, and in the case of a non-custom one, I'm setting just the range value. That's all that's happening inside this code here. So now, if I come in here and I were to do a custom one, and let's just say I want to do it for the 15th to the 1st, and I click submit, you're noticing up here I get a total sales range from the 15th, and you'll notice I get a total sales range to, and this is going to the 1st of March. Now what I can do is go back to my page and actually use these query parameters. So let's scroll down here to where I have my query parameters set up, and I have 2 more query parameters for each of them. I have a from and a to field. So each one of these is going to say from and to. Same thing here, from and to. And then up here, I want to specify the exact same thing. So I'm going to have my total sales range from, just like that. I'm going to have a to field. I'm going to copy these both down as well for the exact same thing. From, to, from, and to. So now I have my individual ranges and the from and to values. So when I get a range option, I'm going to pass in all of that information. So I'm going to get my total sales from and my total sales to, just like that. And inside this function, I'm going to take those in. So we're going to have our start date, which is a date. And this is, of course, optional. And actually, it's going to be passed in as a string. And I'm also going to have my end date, which is an optional string. So now in my code, if my range is equal to null, I want to do something else. So here, I can actually get my start date. So I'm going to change these to say from and to. And my start date is just going to be equal to creating a new date using that from field. Or we'll just use an empty string by default to give us an invalid date. So if from is undefined, this will be an invalid date. Same thing here with my to date. This will be my end date, and this will use the to field here. Now to check if these are real dates, like this is an actual parsable field and this is an actual parsable date, what we can do is use the isValid function from datefns and pass it in our start date. And I can do the exact same thing with our end date. So what I could do is I could say if this is not valid, or we don't have a valid end date, so end date just like that, well then I just want to return. Otherwise, I'm going to return a brand new option from my range option. So I'm going to copy this down for my label. This is essentially going to say custom, but I'm going to change this to actually show the proper information inside of here. So instead of custom, this will be an actually proper information. Then our start date is going to be our start date, and our end date is going to be our end date. So for this label here, instead of custom, I'm going to come in here. I'm going to format the date. So we'll say format date for my start date. Then we're going to put in a hyphen and do the exact same thing for my end date. So we'll copy that over, paste that down, and this will say end date. So now if we have a custom selected range, it'll show me what that range is, and we now have custom start and end dates for that. So here, this is actually getting that information. If I come into this next one here, you can see that I'm going to have my new customer range. This is going to be my from and my to, And we're going to do the exact same thing here. Revenue by product range from, and my revenue to. There we go. So that's at least getting all that information. And now if I expand this out, you'll actually notice it's showing me this is from February 15th to March 1st. And if I change this to be something else, for example, it's going to be to March 12th, and I click submit, you can now see February 15th to March 12th, and I'm actually getting the data for that date range. And let's just test to make sure my all time also works. And as you can see, it's only showing from my very first day of sales all the way to whatever the current day is. So you can see all time is working super fine, but there is still one problem with our charting. If I were to change this to like 365 days, look how small these bar charts are. And that's because there's 365 data points showing up here. And imagine if all time actually had thousands of days worth of data. Obviously that's not ideal. So instead, as my time frame starts to get wider and wider, I want to, instead of showing it by day, show it by week or month or year of actual data. So that's what I want to focus on next. So let's make this a little bit wider. And what we want to do is scroll all the way up to one of these functions where we're actually getting this interval right here. I want to create a separate function to get this interval, and I want the interval to be dependent on how wide the actual range is. So let's scroll all the way down to here. We'll create a function called getChartDateArray, just like that. It's going to take a start date and an end date, which is going to be a date. And by default, I'll set that to a new date just because it's going to go to whatever the current date is by default. And we'll make this an optional field. Actually, there we go. That should be fine. Perfect. So now what I want to do is I want to get the number of days, weeks, months, and so on between each of these dates. So I can say constant days is equal to difference in days between my end date and my start date. So essentially, if these are 100 days apart, this will list 100 and so on. So if my days is less than 30, so if there's less than 30 days between these, I can just show each individual day on my chart because it's close enough together that it's not going to have hundreds and hundreds of data points. So I can return here a new object, and this new object is going to have an array, which is all of my data, which is going to be that each day of interval. I'm going to pass it in an interval, which is my start date and my end date. This is essentially what we've already done before, but I'm also going to pass in a formatter. And this is going to be called format date. And that's because as I get going, we're going to be rendering things by week or by month. So I can't really format all of them the same. The actual formatter needs to be different if I have a scale of weeks or months or days or years. So this is the case where I have less than 30 days. If I have more than 30 days though, then we need to check to see our weeks. So we can say weeks is equal to difference in weeks, just like that. End date, start date. And if my weeks is less than 30, we're just going to always use 30. Well, now I'm saying, you know what? Okay, this is close enough together. There's 30 weeks. I can render out all of that information without it being overloaded. So here, my array that I'm going to be returning is going to be different, or not difference, each week of interval. And I'm going to pass it in an interval. And that's going to be start date, end date, just like that. And then my formatter here is going to be a similar formatter to what we've actually written in the past for our custom range right here. So if I were to do like a custom range here, you can see how this custom range has this hyphen in it. That's essentially what I want to do here. So I'm going to say format date, just like that. We're going to have our start date, and we're going to do it here, format date of our end date. Now I actually want to get these start and end dates because I need them to be at the start and the end of a specific week. So what I can do is I can say const start is equal to, I want to get the start of the week on my current date. There we go. And that's actually going to be because my formatter here is a function that takes in a date, just like that. So here, bring this down. This will be returned from the function. Bring that down, and we'll bring this into here. So I'm going to take whatever my current date is. This is going to be typed as a date. And I'm going to get the start of the week for that. I'm going to do the same thing here for the end of the week. There we go. That's going to be my date, and this will say end of week instead. There we go. And now I want to format the start and the end. But there's one caveat to this, and that I want to make sure that the start of week is never before my start date and the end of week is never before my end date. So I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to put a maximum value, which is either going to be the start date or it's going to be my actual start date. There we go. And I want to make sure I import that max function. Same thing here. I'm going to use the min function, which is going to be either just my end date or the end of the week. Now, the reason that this formatter works is because what's happening is I'm going to be going through each one of these days and I'm going to get an order. And let's say the order happened on March 3rd. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, my date is March 3rd. So I'm going to say, what is the start of the week for March 3rd? And I'm going to say, what is the end of the week for March 3rd? That's going to be my start and end dates. But let's say that my filter only went to March 2nd. That's the starting date. And the start of the week is actually March 1st. Well, this is going to make sure that it's actually only going to show March 2nd instead of March 1st, since my filter never went far enough to get to March 1st. That's why I have these min and max fields in there, and I'll show you what that looks like once we actually finish writing this function. So here's our week version completely done. Now let's move on to what happens in our months case. So we're going to get our difference in months, because if we have more than 30 weeks, well, then we need to render out a different format. So difference in months between my end date and my start date. There we go. And if this is less than 30, then we can render this out just fine. So we can come in here and we're going to return our information. For our array, this is going to be essentially what we've done for all of these, which is going to be each month of interval, and we're going to have an interval with our start date and our end date, just like that. And then our formatter is going to be relatively simple. It's going to be using the new INTL date time format. It's going to be using the English formatter. And we're just going to say that the month is going to be long form, and we're going to say that the year is going to be numeric. So essentially it's just going to show only the month and only the year, and we want the format function from there. Then finally, in the case where we have more than 30 months, well, we want to do this by year instead of month. So we'll say each year of interval. And for our formatter, we want to render out just the year, and that is it, just like that. And I need to make sure I add in commas here to make sure all my errors go away. And now this function is working. And this will just make sure we get the proper interval, whether we have too much data or not enough data. So what we can do is scroll all the way up to where we're actually getting our intervals, which is inside of here. So our day array, we can actually change to get our chart date array. And what we can do is we can pass in our start date and our end date. So it's created after and created before, just like that. Now, technically these options could be nullable. And if you remember correctly, we actually had a check here to actually get the first date if this was null. And if this one was null, we're just going to pass in a new date, just like that. So now this is actually going to return to us some information. So we can come in here. This is going to return to us an array as well as a format function, just like that. And we can say that our day array is equal to array.map. There we go. And now, instead of using format date, we want to use the formatter we get back from here. So here, same thing, we're going to use our formatter that we get back. And now I'm just going to copy this code, and I'm going to use it down here as well. So this exact place, I'm essentially going to copy all of this, paste that in. So we have our array and our formatter. Here, our day array is going to be mapping over that, but it's going to be total users instead of total sales. There we go. And make sure we use format instead of format date here. And that should be all we need to do to actually hook this up. So I'll show you why we did this. If we expand this over and let's go to 365 days, you'll now notice we're actually filtering by month instead of by day, instead of by week. And that's because we have more than 30 weeks of data showing up. If we were to do 90 days, this is more than 30 days worth of data. So as you can see here, it's showing you by week instead of by day. And you'll notice at this very end here where it says March 10th to March 15th, that's not actually a full week. That's only 6 days. But that's because we don't have any data for March 16th. That is past our end date. So we're cutting off this at March 15th. That's what that formatter is doing at the very end here. If we look at our code, we scroll all the way down to that section where it's happening. That's essentially what this min and max value is doing, is making sure we don't ever show a label for data we're not actually rendering on our chart. And if we were to do something like last 7 days, obviously we're going to get a daily chart here because we have 30 or less days. And that's all it takes to create this awesome admin dashboard with all these different charts. Now, if you want to learn how to build this entire Next.js e-commerce project from scratch, I'm going to have a video linked right over here, which covers how to get started with this entire project. It's super in-depth and covers everything you need to know. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.